This is more than a podcast. It is a movement. Our mission is to transform the body of Christ one rep at a time through a holistic gospel message that integrates the spiritual and the physical. This is the Lightweight Strength Academy podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lightweight Strength Academy podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Webster, and on this podcast, we aim to integrate the spiritual and the physical by transforming the body of Christ one rep at a time. The previous episode, we talked about God in the gym. We're continuing our series on Muscular Christianity. God in the gym, or rather, before I state that, this material is coming from the book entitled Muscular Christianity, Manhood in Sports in Protestant America, 1880-1920. We're going to continue with God in the gym, but specifically talking now about one of the subtopics within this chapter, the YMCA. The YMCA stands for the Young Men's Christian Association. This is an interesting topic, one of my personal favorites, which I thought it would be necessary to have its own individual episode, considering that most of us probably know of the YMCA, maybe have had a membership at one, or maybe we continue to have a membership at the YMCA. And if you're like me, you've had a membership and have worked at the YMCA. So there's a lot of interesting details that we're going to discuss as we look to the history, purpose, and just the overall impact of the YMCA as it relates to the muscular Christian movement. We talked a little bit about one of the quotes that was made about the YMCA, and it's interesting because this quote was made by G. Stanley Hall, and he stated, among all the marvelous advances of Christianity, either within this organization, speaking about the YMCA, or without it, in this land and century, or in any other lands and ages, the future historian of the Church of Christ will place this movement of carrying the gospel to the body as one of the most epic making. The YMCA played a pretty significant role in the muscular Christianity movement. For those of you who are watching the video version of the podcast, throughout this entire series, I will have a PowerPoint that will correspond with the points that we discuss. Let's begin by talking about the birth of the YMCA. George Williams, a former turned London dry goods clerk, founded the YMCA, or the Young Men's Christian Association, and even as a young man, as a young adult himself, he saw the need that other Williams and several of his Englishmen peers were troubled by the bleak landscape of industrialized London and how it negatively impacted young men. We can learn something from George Williams here. Even as an individual, we should think about more than ourselves, to the point that if we see a need, we should do our very best to meet a need. George Williams started the YMCA to serve as a refuge for young men who were seeking shelter from the hard life of the London streets. So the birth of the YMCA in America was started by Captain Thomas Sullivan. He was a retired sea captain, and he was introduced to the YMCA during his missionary trip to London. And you can almost imagine what would have took place, right? Now that he's retired, he's probably thinking a little bit more about life, and he's considering those matters that are really important versus the trivial matters. And he sees this interesting organization, that being the Young Men Christian Association. And being a man of faith himself, well, he thought, I know a lot of men by whom I've been surrounded and those back home who could benefit from an organization such as the YMCA. Greatly impressed with the organization, he and several of his clergy companions started the first U.S. branch of the YMCA in 1851 at the Old South Church in Boston. Similar to London's George Williams, Captain Sullivan aspired to provide a home away from home for American seamen on leave. Here's an interesting point made in the book by Clifford Putney. Their aim, speaking of the YMCA, like that of many philanthropic ventures of the time, was domestic and rescue-oriented. Specifically, it entailed providing a home away from home for Protestant young men newly arrived in the city, thereby ensuring that they did not suffer for want of Christian surroundings. The YMCA provided a Christian atmosphere, which evidently wasn't as prevalent in that day and time. Some would argue, well, what about the church itself? there are certain avenues where an organization may be able to take to reach people that the church may not be able to. Athletics, physical training, sports is going to be an avenue that the YMCA utilizes to reach men. And so Bible study, educational programs, prayer meetings, rooms, gymnasiums were added to the overnight lodging of the YMCA as the organization grew. So you can see how this response to the social issues, to the needs of men in London, now extended into America, is beginning to shape and form to meet not only the social needs but the spiritual needs of these men as well. Now let's look to the purpose and popularity of the YMCA. The aim of the YMCA was domestic and rescue oriented, as we read in the book. And so it ultimately wanted to save men from the impact and ultimately wanted to save men from the impact and the influence of urbanization, industrialization, all of the immoral things that were going on in the society at that time. And again, there was a lot of stuff going on, right? You had immigrants moving over to America. You had people who were involved in who were heavily agricultural, come from a heavily agricultural environments, now going to these mechanical plants and things like that. And men are encouraged to study more rather than to use their physicality, to use their bodies. And so there's a lot going on, a lot happening. And as we looked at in the previous episodes, men were starting to become soft physically. The YMCA was trying to meet that need, of course. They wanted to save men from the detriment of society. Its popularity going from a single YMCA in Boston in 1851 to over 260. It shows the relevance of the organization in response to social changes on men. This organization, what it was trying to do, resonated so much with communities that it began to grow like wildfire. It reminds me of what Viktor Frankl said about his book when he was interviewed. He wrote a book entitled Man's Search for Meaning. And when asked about his book being a bestseller or something of the sorts, he mentioned that he doesn't know whether to be happy about that or if that's a good thing or if it shows the lack of meaning in that day and time. The growth and popularity of the YMCA highlighted that people were in need of an organization like this. By the late 19th century, the organization was operating in several countries, addressing and meeting the needs of men in various cultural contexts. As wonderful and as beautiful as the YMCA was and still is, it isn't perfect, right? Let's discuss racial discrimination in the YMCA. Segregation was a national policy. This resulted in a department like the Colored Men's Association in 1890. And in the book here, the Central Committee, later headquartered in New York and renamed the International Committee, undertook supervision of the YMCA's various home and foreign work departments and special associations. These groups by 1905 numbered 22. They included such departments as that for education and for religious and missionary development, and such associations as the Student Association and the Railroad Men's Association. There was also a special Colored Men's Association whose existence reflected the racist belief of many whites within the YMCA that blacks ought not to be integrated into the main body of the Y. Some individual northern associations disagreed with racial segregation and began to integrate their facilities early in the 20th century, but segregation persisted in some southern associations until well after 1946, the year desegregation was made a national YMCA goal. 8 years before the Civil War, the first YMCA serving black men was established in Washington, D.C. in 1853. It was established by a former slave named Anthony Bowen, who, if you're watching the video version of the podcast, you'll see him on the screen here in the middle. Anthony Bowen, after having bought his freedom, resonated with the YMCA's mission until he realized that the YMCA's mission wasn't for him. And so he decided that he was going to organize the YMCA for colored men and boys. Anthony Bowen, and this is coming from African Americans in the YMCA Archives and Special Collections at University of Minnesota Library. Anthony Bowen was born into slavery in 1809. He would eventually purchase his freedom, and he would go on to be the first black clerk in the U.S. Patent Office. And then, after he heard of the YMCA from his white coworker, he would go on and started YMCA for black men and boys in Washington, D.C. As Anthony Bowen's work in the 1850s indicates, African Americans were eager to embrace the mission of the YMCA early on, but racial discrimination and the resulting depressed social and financial conditions for black people made it difficult for the movement to grow very quickly. Nevertheless, by the late 1860s, the movement found a firm foothold in the community with associations established in the New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, so on and so forth. The struggle for civil and human rights in the YMCA continued until segregation of the organization ended in 1946, dissolving its colored men's department. We're talking years later, the YMCA decided that they were going to eliminate the colored men's department and integrate. But even through all of that, I mean, the majority of its membership in the 19th century were young men under 40. But I want to look a little bit deeper at the race issues in the YMCA. Hunton and Moreland assembled a staff of talented young men who carried the Y mission to black communities across the country, building sound programs from the ground up. They were major contributors to the black self-help movement. Now, although the separate YMCAs were created because racist policies prevalent in many areas precluded integration, they served an important role in their communities. Programs were similar to those of otherwise Bible study, moral and religious improvement, adult education, physical education, and organized sports. Black associations housed lending libraries and built pools and gyms, while segregated associations were the result of systemic racism in the YMCA movement. Black YMCAs also became what one white leader called educational and spiritual oases, secure places where members could discuss prominent public issues of the day without having to mute expression of their views as African Americans. What a beautiful, beautiful thought here. Now, even though the black YMCAs were heavily underfunded, they still made it possible to come together to study God's word, to follow Jesus, and then to come and talk about the social issues of their day amongst each other without feeling fearful. There's a great lesson that we can learn from that. Even when we have very little, we can do a lot. We don't have to settle for the lack of resources when we have some resources. We don't have to settle for people telling us that a Christian ideal isn't for us. Take the book, read it, and apply it for yourself. I don't have to wait for someone to approve and accept of me, for me to realize and understand that Jesus died for me just as well as he died for them. The YMCA, as beautiful of an ideal it was, it sadly perpetuated the ideas of the culture, even though it within itself was trying to address the issues of the culture. That's the one issue it seems that many failed to overcome. The international work also fueled the fight for integration. These black leaders in the YMCA, after all they had done, they began to question, they began to talk about their impact and influence, and they weren't going to take them being less than anymore. They wanted to be equals. Continuing on, let's talk about the period of expansion and adaptation. Despite its evangelical Protestant church basis, the YMCA promoted unity and cooperation among Victorian sentimentality and strict religious creedalism. The YMCA were trying to get out of the mindset of being overly strict about religious practices so that they could reach more people. Now, of course, they were met with their share of resistance. In fact, some of the conservative clergymen began to worry and wonder about the YMCA's commitment to religious conversion. They began to wonder if the YMCA would lose its original purpose. Nevertheless, the organization maintained that it was an ally to the church, reaching men beyond its orbit and directing them into active membership in the church. So there were many conservative clergymen who thought the YMCA would be an enemy to them by taking men away from the church, and men who didn't come to church by motivating them to stay away from the church. But the YMCA reassured those individuals that they were actually an ally, that they maybe through sports and the discussion of social issues could reach men that maybe the church couldn't reach. And then the YMCA would in turn direct those men to the church. Now, albeit the church of their choosing, of course. The scope of the YMCA had widened to include the blue-collar working man. They didn't just want the educated, the one who knew the Bible inside out, the one who was often frail physically. They didn't just want that person. They wanted the strong, the rugged man as well. And when wealthy businessmen began to see this, they invested millions of dollars into programs, into gymnasiums, all of these different facets of the YMCA, all because the YMCA expanded and adapted to meeting the needs of young working class men in order to Christianize those men. Let's look at character builders. Characteristic of the YMCA during its period of expansion was a commitment to the ideals of the strenuous life, physical hardness, vigorous action, etc. This whole character building business came about because boys, and this is coming from Clifford Putney in the book, boys' work for the Y meant moving away from its old custodial rule, keeping young men from sin, and the adoption of a more progressive goal, character building. So the YMCA wasn't aiming to put boys to work for the sake of keeping them busy, for the sake of keeping them away from sin, but they wanted to add something to them. They wanted to reward them with something. Character building, continuing on in the book, as the name implies, required not the preservation of morals already taught, but rather the strengthening of boys so as to ward off degeneracy. Character builders thought it essential that the boy, why men always spoke of the boy, an embryonic man, never of the more androgynous child, have his masculinity cultivated at the outset, otherwise he might never develop into a leader capable of asserting American values. So you have to think about, why would they want to make sure that the character of young men was one that would develop a young man not into a boy, but into a leader? The motivation behind this was their battle against male softness that they believe was brought on by urbanization. We talked about this in great detail in the previous episodes. The aim of this work was not just to keep young men from sin, but to build character, right? And so so this effort in building character by work indicated that the work that they were doing had moral value, or at least would yield moral value. The preacher here where I labor, Rick Janelle, often talks about how he had his sons to paint how his grandfather would have his sons to paint the house, I believe. And they would ask, well, why do you have us painting the house? And he said, well, give you something to do. But they never knew all along that he was teaching them and building them from boys into men, helping them to take responsibility, helping them to carry their own weight. Now, just as much as work was essential to building character, the YMCA also viewed physical exercise as an important facet of character building. This would increase the popularity of YMCA gymnasiums. At first, YMCAs viewed their gymnasiums as a means to save souls, not to build character. And this is coming from the book, by the way. They thought them a likely snare for those young men for whom YMCA teas, tracts, and Bible readings held no allure. Even so, objections that athletics were unchristian dissuaded some YMCAs from ever trying them. So there were, again, a mixture of emotions when it came to physical exercise and athletics in general being an important facet of character building. Let's look at the next point here. Athletics in the YMCA. Although the YMCA viewed athletics as fulfilling a need, they did not initially stress the religious nature of athletics. I believe this was the case because, again, there were diverse opinions regarding athletics. Some people were supporters, some were not. According to George Fisher, athletics offered the best hope for making men feel intensely, which he deemed necessary. Men needed a way to feel manly in a good way. And so the YMCA, according to George Fisher, by taking on athletics, would provide them an adequate and efficient way that didn't involve sin, that didn't involve crime of any kind, to help men tap into that masculine side of themselves to feel intensely, to challenge them, right? He deemed this necessary. The gap that existed between athletics and Christianity would be narrowed by 3 dedicated individuals. Before we get to those individuals, let me read something from the book here. The association, speaking of the YMCA, secretaries responded by bemoaning the lack of Christian men available for directing sports and by praising effusively any whom they found. So although George Fisher made the statement about how athletics would provide the best hope, there were little to no Christian men available to lead that effort. This is coming from one YMCA leader who in 1898. There is a natural antagonism between these two types of men, which often amounts to contempt on the part of the stronger one, The breach daily widens. The nice, pious men rise to power in the reading room, library, and reception room. The strong, hardy fellows in the gymnasium. Two factions exist. The one emphasizes too much the spirit, the other the body. One talks about the physical department being unmanageable and a disgrace to the association. The other about the spider-legged, namby-pamby hypocrites in management who want them to play girls' games. It was similar to that of the religious factions that existed in the early biblical time period with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These two had different ideals. Unfortunately for the YMCA, there emerged in the latter half these three individuals who I began to mention earlier, and the three were Robert McBurney from 1837 to 1898, Robert J. Roberts from 1849 to 1920, and Luther Gulick from 1865 to 1918. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these men because they made some important contributions to the gap between, or to narrowing the gap between athletics and Christianity. First, let's start with Robert J. McBurney here. Now, Robert J. McBurney was the secretaryship of the struggling New York YMCA, molding it within the decade into America's most influential Y. 1862 was McBurney. Now, this guy never married. He devoted his whole life to the betterment of young men. So you could say that he was fully invested into this effort. He lived in the tower room of the 23rd Street YMCA, which he helped build and which he equipped with one of the association's earliest, most munificent gyms. His greatest accomplishment, however, was the fourfold plan, the first clear rationale for combining athletics with evangelism. He proposed this in 1869. It advocated ministry to all four aspects of a young man's life: bodily, social, spiritual, and intellectual. So you can see the Robert McBurney with his fourfold plan definitely had influence in the early parts of the YMCA as it sought to narrow the gap between athletics and Christianity. The next, Robert J. Roberts, 1849 to 1920, he was a man of short stature, extremely muscular. He was said to be very strong. He was a devout Baptist. He would leave his career as a mechanic and wood turner to work as a gymnastic superintendent for the Boston Association. He would coin the term bodybuilding and won awards as the association's first Christian physical director. He also labored to switch the Boston organization's emphasis from heavy exercise to light gymnastics, concentrating on reducing office work midriffs. Robert's recreational philosophy, developed after a bad fall and calculated to attract the amateur gymnast, was that athletics should above all be short, safe, easy, pleasing, and beneficial. So originally, this guy who was a bodybuilder had a change of heart after an accident that he had, and he began to not stop exercising or training physically altogether, but he adapted, right? And perhaps one of the most influential, or the most influential, is Luther Gulick. Now, Luther Gulick from 1865 to 1918, he was considered the greatest of YMCA philosophers. Now, up to a point, he agreed with Robert McBurney's fourfold plan, but he would disagree with it to a great extent. In many cases, he stated, reading from the book here, there have been some very bad results from his plan. We can trace to the fourfold conception of our work, namely failure to invest in Y athletics with moral purpose. Now, if you will recall, he stressed the gymnasium was neither a trap to catch young men nor something that existed only for the bodies of its members. Instead, it belongs to the YMCA as a fundamental and intrinsic part in the salvation of men. And so, again, he's disagreeing with the fourfold plan to an extent of Robert McBurney, showing that it failed in many aspects. And the most important one, perhaps in his opinion, was the athletics. Now, Gulick's first two jobs, both starting in 1887, were with the YMCA as Director of Physical Training at Springfield College and as Secretary for the International Committee's newly formed Physical Department. He also advocated unceasingly the cause of physical education, editing within the space of 20 years 4 movement journals, including the August American Physical Education Review, and writing 5 books, one of which he dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Gulick, his father, was a Christian man, but didn't find any moral value in physical training and exercise. And Gulick, who saw his father study more often than he saw his father being physically active, was hoping to convince other Christians like his father of the moral value of play and or physical activity, exercise. And so Gulick would originate the most influential part of the YMCA in this regard, the triangle. That triangle, that red symbol, indicated body, mind, and spirit. And he got this from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Gulick saw the holistic nature of this command. We can't just love God with one aspect of our person. This triangle, body, mind, spirit, which started as a magazine entitled The Triangle, would eventually be adopted by the YMCA as its official seal. Under Gulick and the YMCA during that time, many of the contribution to the association in athletics included basketball and volleyball. Basketball developed in 1891 by James Naismith, who also was a minister. It originally served as an indoor substitute for football. And then volleyball was initially put on as an exhibition game by Gulick in 1896. Both of these sports were specifically interesting and valuable to the YMCA because they promoted what they were hoping for the entire time and building character and building Christian principles and characteristics. Both of these sports spread very quickly throughout the association because of their compatibility with the association's new athletic ideals: teamwork, ease of access, and applicability to all ages. These three men helped to really narrow the gap between athletics and the YMCA and helped to further the advancements of popular sports like basketball and volleyball. As we prepare to close, we're just going to look at the summary and application of all that we've discussed. No greater impact had any organization, said G. Stanley Hall, on integrating religion and sport than the Young Men's Christian Association. As a result of its efforts, Christians looked upon the YMCA red triangle and seeing body, mind, and spirit freed, no more bruised and blighted, build the new humanity, wholly strong and united. Christians, there's a lot that we can emulate here. We can emulate the YMCA and free our bodies of the traditions and prejudices that harm us, to break down the barriers between Christianity and physical health. We can start now putting an emphasis on the physical person, not to the detriment of the spiritual, but to the advancement and progression of the spiritual, to the aid of the spiritual. There are several verses that corresponds with this ideal. 1 Corinthians chapter 6:19, you are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. We talked about in every episode, our bodies were given to us by God. These aren't cheap, and so we can't treat them like they're cheap. We have to take care of our bodies and utilize our bodies in service to God. 1 Corinthians 3:16-17, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? If we understand truly that we are the temple of God, sure, the aesthetic part is going to come along with physical training. But we're going to give our due diligence in making sure that we keep our house clean. If we understand that the Spirit of God has taken up residence in our bodies. 3 John 1-2. There John prayed for his friend and saying, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. And then, of course, the verse that corresponds with Deuteronomy 6 and verse 5 that helped Gulick to develop the red triangle for the YMCA body, mind, spirit. Love the Lord all your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. We have a duty to our physical persons to make sure that we emphasize the importance of caring for our bodies, our minds, and spirits, and promoting that unity, that strength in our faith, throughout our congregations. I hope that you found value in today's episode. We're going to continue this series on muscular Christianity. Please leave a comment, like and subscribe, and share if you haven't already, to help put this content in our channel in front of the eyes of people who may be searching. As always, keep transforming the body of Christ one rep at a time.